One of the most common myths about both these Boer Wars is, oh, the British just wanted all the gold. They just wanted all the diamonds. And that is just wrong because the British were fighting for control either in a conciliatory manner or militarily for decades before even diamonds were discovered in South Africa. What the British wanted is they wanted a confederation that looked a little bit like what they had in Canada. The British wanted to have a monopoly on ports that led their route to India. So for decades and decades, the British tried to keep some kind of soft control or influence over the area just to make sure that nothing could disrupt their trade with India. And the British just wanted as little as possible to rock the boat in South Africa so that they could have free trade, quote unquote, that wasn't going to be disrupted by wars that would really sink the British treasury.
The United States has spent the last couple of years dealing with a very painful reckoning of racial issues in its past. One nation that's arguably fraught with even more racial tension is South Africa. The reasons are extremely complicated, but much of it has to do with a series of settlements and wars that were fought over 100 years ago. And these wars, called the Boer Wars, still ripple South Africa today with their effects. These are two wars fought in the 1880s and the early 1900s between the British Empire and independent states in South Africa, inhabited by ethnic Dutch and others. But it's important to note that South Africa didn't become what it is today by accident, though Europeans did settle it by accident, at least at first. Over the 18th and 19th centuries, white settlements expanded intentionally across southern Africa, but chaotically as well. Well, these European settlers weren't the only ones expanding in southern Africa. The Zulu tribe also expanded and absorbed other tribal members whom they didn't annihilate. Many clashes between black tribes and white settlers broke out, and these clashes didn't follow racial lines, nor were they always over resources. Most of these clashes are largely forgotten, and even the so-called Boer War remains extremely misunderstood. Today's guest is Michael Buster. He's the host of the Forgotten Wars podcast, a more than 40-chapter podcast with the first season focusing exclusively on the Boer War and control over southern Africa. Some have mischaracterized the Anglo-Boer War as the British Empire's Vietnam, while others have drawn parallels between it and the U.S. invasion of Iraq in 2003. Some argue that it was simply a war over natural resources, over gold mines and diamond mines, and some have argued that the British invented concentration camps during the Second Boer War of 1899 and 1902. So there are a lot of things that we discuss in this episode. It's really not just about the Boer Wars, but about issues that were engulfing the globe during the 19th and 20th centuries, such as how the British botched abolition in the Cape Colony and sowed the seeds for many future wars, and attempts at abolition in South Africa are contrasted with the approach that Abraham Lincoln took to abolish slave states at State of the Union. We look at how the Boer Wars, interestingly enough, made Winston Churchill. He was in a POW camp, which he wrote accounts of this that led to lucrative book sales that helped him fund his first political campaign and win a seat in the House of Commons. We discuss whether the British really invented concentration camps during the Anglo-Boer War. And lastly, noting that the British won, how is it possible to win a war that's fought thousands of miles away from your motherland when in most cases this type of war is lost? The Revolutionary War, the Vietnam War, and other things like this. So this is a war that most people don't understand well, but has surprisingly large implications for the 20th and even the 21st centuries. So I hope you enjoyed this discussion with Michael Buster. Michael, welcome to the show.
Thanks so much for having me, Scott.
When I was looking into this issue and the points that you made about the Boer War on your podcast, there were a lot of things that I never really thought about with South Africa, that it is very similar to the United States and it has a mixed race population. It dealt with some very painful growing pains of trying to integrate its population together. And it did some similar things as the United States, but also some very different things due to its native culture, due to its political circumstances of the time. And it's an interesting sort of test case to understand how these developments that we know well in the United States play out differently in other parts of the world. And with South Africa, in my mind, I think I just placed it as part of the general British Empire. And I knew that there are people who grew up there, like J.R.R. Tolkien, Charlize Theron is from South Africa, but didn't really think of it in terms of people who came there as settlers, but had lived there for so long that they really became part of the native population but the differences were stark enough to cause conflict. So let's just go back to the very beginning and open up what you went into in incredible depth on your podcast. So what is the beginning of South African history as you explore on your show and as we consider the Boer War, where white settlers initially end up there? So let's start there. That sounds good.
Great. So the Nuva Harlem, this was a ship of the Dutch East India Company. And on March 25th, 1647, this ship went high and dry near a town called Blauberg, just north of the Salt River. The crew members, though, were lucky enough that they escaped this shipwreck. But unfortunately, Leondert Jans and about 62 other crew members could not fit aboard another vessel that was going to make a return to the Netherlands. That's where the Dutch East India came from. So for a year, these 63 men waited at what we now call South Africa. They waited, and they were safely home a couple years later. And in a report to the Dutch East India Company, Jans and his crew argued that they should put a permanent refreshment station where they crashed, ironically enough. The natives, they reported there, were peaceful, and that the soil was actually good for harvesting crops, and that they would actually have a shot at trading, which, of course, was what the Dutch East India Company was all about. So the Dutch East India Company approved that this little refreshment station would get set up, and so they sent 3 more ships in 1652. So originally, whites showed up here by accident, and when they showed up in a little bit more force aboard these 3 ships, it was just as a refreshment post. Almost like a Gila Bend. I don't know how many listeners are from Arizona, but there's this little podunk town between Phoenix, Arizona, and Yuma, Arizona. And that place gets millions of people passing through it each year. But I mean, it has just over 1,000 people living there, and it's nothing more than a place that people pass through. And that's all that this part of what we now call South Africa was for a time. It was just a place to pass through for the Dutch East India Company.
I think we'd be remiss to not talk about the condition of African tribal society. That would, I could hear some audience or some listeners tisking me for beginning the history just with a white settler showing up first. That, what, you don't think there was a history before? So in context of the African tribes who were there, what was the political situation at the time? And I wonder, how much of exposure did they have to European explorers, European traders? Because going around the Horn of Africa is something that had already, even before the Dutch trading company had set up an outpost, had been happening for centuries with Vasco da Gama. So even if there wasn't a permanent settlement, I would imagine there would be some level of interaction, sort of in the way that on the Lewis and Clark expedition, they encountered some American Indians who spoke scattered bits of English due to interactions with British fishermen or other people who were on the Pacific coast. So what was the political situation at the time, and did they have much interaction with European traders beforehand?
That's an excellent question and a very fair question. Our answers to that question are a little bit harder to nail down just because of the records of what the situation was geopolitically before whites showed up isn't quite as systematic. But I'm going to answer that question in part by telling you about a force called Umfakane. The Zulu meaning for this word is the hammering or the crushing. And so what that means is a number of things. There were scores of African tribes in what we now call Southern Africa before any whites showed up. But during this time of Umfakane, that was happening during the 1600s and 1700s and into the 1800s, were that a bunch of these smaller kingdoms started to consolidate into a few larger kingdoms. And as these kingdoms got larger, they started to focus more on improving their militaries and mobilizing more of their men to fight in a military. And so what this caused was a lot of tribes to flee when they were confronted by a much larger tribe. And let me tell you the story of Shaka Zulu. This might help your listeners put more of a face to this force that we're talking about. So I'm going to jump ahead about 100 years, but this is not like the only case of Umfukane. Shaka Zulu was born in 1787. And so his father was the chief of the Zulu. This tribe, when Shaka's father was in charge, had only 4,000 to 5,000 people that was in its confederation. Now, Shaka, he was bullied and treated really terrible by older children. Part of it had to do with his questionable status as a member of his father's family. His father had many wives and mistresses, and Shaka was not the son of one of those higher tier wives, you could say. So Shaka would be bullied. Kids would make him catch boiling hot food in his hands. He would get mocked for, and hopefully this isn't too much for your listeners, for his small penis and his crinkled ears. And he would harbor a great hatred. But when he was 15 or 16, he gets initiated into this kind of military cadet school for 15 to 16-year-olds. And he was a star kid. And after his father died, with a lot of murder and intrigue happening, Shaka managed to rise to the top of the Zulu. And he turned this confederation of tribes under Zulu control into something much more powerful, much more militant. And they took 100 chiefdoms, 100 different little kingdoms under their wing. The members who survived being taken under the Zulu wing were incorporated into the Zulu Confederation and its army. So, to put it in another way, some of the first people that were already there before the Dutch East India showed up, they were referred to by whites, so probably not the perfect name for these people, were Bushmen. And they were believed to be some of the first human beings to ever have inhabited the earth in Africa, like were the direct ancestors of some of these Bushmen. So that was some of the people that the whites of like the very first refreshment post in Southern Africa ran into. But then they also ran into more and more tribes who were being pushed around by this force of Umfukane, by big tribes like the Zulu, who were getting more and more powerful.
So the history here, I think for those who haven't looked specifically at South Africa, gets a bit confusing. You have Dutch settlers first. They're the language. One of the languages in South Africa is Afrikaans, which is a variation of Dutch. And I've read that when a person from the Netherlands speaks to somebody that speaks Afrikaans, they understand one another, but the language is in some senses more simple. And they'll use, interesting constructions in Afrikaans, where they might use a compound noun to describe something that's one noun in Dutch. But what happens with the evolution of the settlement of more Dutch merchants and later colonists, and then the British incursion as well?
Right. It's a pretty interesting story. And also, ironically, and kind of sort of an echo from something else that happened pretty close to home for us, was around religious freedom. Part of the people that came to Southern Africa came from France. They were French Huguenots. And after a Treaty of Armagnac was signed in France, it promised that, hey, we're going to allow religious freedom here. But then the French government went back on that promise. So it sent a lot of Protestants, like the French Huguenots, into flight. So in addition to Dutch people starting to settle Southern Africa, you had some French Huguenots who decided they were going to find more freedom in this colony far, far away, like 9,000 miles away in Southern Africa. So you had a few hundred of those show up to Southern Africa. And so they would help develop the area. And then, of course, the British got involved with Southern Africa because they were looking for an intermediate station to their most prized colony. And that most prized colony was India. And so they also started to take interest in this area of Southern Africa. So you started to get some more British settlement in Southern Africa as well. So you started to have this cocktail, if you will, of French, Dutch, and British descendants descending on southern Africa.
Do these communities remain, it appears that they remain more distinct than, say, a melting pot in the United States. Is that correct? And if so, what is the reason for that?
So the French and the Dutch settlers appear to have melded pretty well. And yeah, they were able to own land. There weren't different rights for French people than there were for Dutch descendants. The British started to set up some settlements in Natal. That's also part of what we now call South Africa. And some of those became more distinctly English in their orientation. But that's not to say that they weren't sharing space with other Dutch descendants as well. But some of the earlier settlements, like the Huguenots and the Dutch, they definitely were more of a melting pot, creating kind of their own culture of farming. And those who worked for the Dutch East India Company for a time were able to eventually strike out on their own and start to own some of their own land. And then, of course, sadly enough, you start to see as their holdings grow, they decide, you know what, to do the really hard manual labor is something that's a little bit beneath us. So then they started to import slaves.
Well, then jumping ahead a few years, you point to one event that you say shapes the course of South African history, and that's a near-death experience of Paul Kruger. So what is this event? About what time does this take place, and how does this shape the history of South Africa?
So this event is, it is fascinating. And here's the interesting thing. The way that you would pronounce Kruger's name in Afrikaans is actually Kreer. Paul Kreer. So that took me some coaching from a Afrikaans speaking friend. Paul Kreer would eventually become a 4-time elected president of one of the republics that make up now present day South Africa. And it was called the South African Republic, or also the Transvaal. He was elected president 4 times. And this guy was something else in a lot of ways. He was ridiculously brave as a youth. Like, this guy would go into gunfire and be shouting orders, telling people where to go, even though he was standing where plenty of gunfire had taken down a bunch of his fellow soldiers. He got pretty wealthy. He was very religious, like a very literal kind of religious, to where he believed, his interpretation of the Bible, that still in 1900, he thought that the earth was flat. That was what his religious sect taught. So very interesting guy, but this guy might not have even made it into the 1890s, if not for this event turning out in the most unlikely way. So I'm going to tell you about it from his lips. This happened in 1845 when he was on the hunt for elephants. So this will be from his lips. After about an hour's ride, I came across a rhinoceros and shot at it. But I only succeeded in wounding the animal, and it fled into the wood. I dismounted quickly, ready to shoot again, but moved only a few steps away from my horse, lest the rhinoceros should turn to attack me, in which case it would be necessary to remount at once. I succeeded in getting a second shot, but at that very moment my rifle exploded just where I held it with my left hand, and my left thumb, the lock and the ramrod, lay before me on the ground, and the barrel of the gun behind me. I had no time to think, for the furious animal was almost upon me, so I jumped on my horse and galloped away as fast as I could with the rhinoceros in fierce pursuit, until we came to the ford of a little Sprite, when my pursuer came to the ground and so allowed me to ride quietly in the direction of our wagons. During the next day, our people, guided by the track of my horse, went to the spot where they found the rhinoceros still alive and, following the trail of blood, discovered the remains of the rifle and my thumb. So this happened early 1800. This guy lost his thumb, and medicine, especially in southern Africa, wasn't exactly modern at that point. So this is how he decides to handle it. My hand was in a horrible state. The great veins were torn asunder, and the muscles lay exposed, the flesh hanging in strips. I bled like a slaughtered calf. I had succeeded in tying a large pocket handkerchief round the wound while riding. When I got to the wagons, my wife and sister-in-law were sitting by the fire, and I went up to them laughing so as not to frighten them. My sister-in-law pointed to my hand, which looked like a great piece of raw meat. I called out to my wife to go to the wagon and fetch some turpentine. Then I asked my sister-in-law to take off my bandolier, and she saw that my hand was torn and noticed how white I was, for I had hardly any blood left in my body. I kept on renewing the turpentine bandages, for turpentine is a good remedy to burn the veins up, as the Boers would say, and thus to stop the bleeding. I sent my youngest brother to borrow as much turpentine as he could get from the nearest farm, which was about a half-hour's ride away. Herman Poetheater came over with his brother. The former got into the wagon, and when he saw the wound, he cried out, "That hand will never heal. It is an awful wound." He had to get down again as quickly as possible, for he was nigh of fainting. But his brother said, possibly to comfort me, "Nonsense. I have seen worse wounds than that. Get plenty of turpentine." We drove to the farm. Everyone there advised me to send for a doctor and have the hand amputated, but I positively refused to allow myself to be still further mutilated of my own free will. The 2 joints of what once was my thumb had gone, but it appeared that it would be necessary to remove a piece of bone. So he eventually, Creer, takes his own pocket knife and he cuts the rest of his own thumb off. And then eventually what happens for Creer is a really interesting remedy. He decides that, hey, there is a remedy that we know amongst us Boers, where if you stick a infected limb or something that's been bleeding and infected for a while, if you stick it up inside of a sheep's guts, you will actually stem the infection. Because at this point, his arm was starting to change colors because of how bad the infection was. So Creer goes and finds a slaughtered sheep, or they slaughter a sheep, stuffs his hand up inside of the sheep. And the crazy thing is this actually worked. The infection stops, and he says something that I just found hilarious. I mean, I'm no scientist or genius, but he says, yes, we think this stemmed the infection because the sheep feed on a particular herb nearby this river, which to my mind goes, why not go and get this herb and, put it in some boiling water or something? Like, get the herb. Why do you got to go through all the steps of sticking your infected hand inside of a sheep? But hey, that's just me. Whatever the merits of the method, it worked. And if it hadn't worked, wow, South Africa's history could have been very different. There could have been no Boer War even, or no South African War of 1899 to 1902.
It's interesting that personalities like that in, let's say, quote unquote, civilized society back in the motherland may not do as well. They may not seem a little bit too outlandish or eccentric to mingle among high society and find placement there. But in a more frontier type of setting, or when you have to improvise, jump headlong into situations that some would describe as recklessly, those qualities can make you do well there. So whether it's a conquistador, whether it's somebody operating on the frontier, it's interesting that you see qualities like that. And just so as we're going through the chronology here, he is a 4-time president of Transvaal. Now, at this time, there are different states within South Africa. Before looking at the seeds of the Boer War and issues like British trying to abolish slavery, but it doesn't work as well in South Africa as it does in other parts of their empire. These different states, when are they consolidating? Do they maintain independence from one another throughout the 19th century, or are they all distinct at this time?
Yeah, they're all distinct. So let me paint a bit of a picture for you. There was the Cape Colony that turned into a British colony. There were 2 colonies north of the Cape Colony that eventually emerged. One was called the Orange Free State. That was a free Boer republic. And then the other colony alongside that Orange Free State was the Transvaal, also known as the South African Republic. That was also a Boer republic.
And by Boer, just for terminology, does that refer to ethnic Dutch people who are living in South Africa?
So the term originally referred just to farmers who emerged in the Cape Colony during the time of Dutch control. And eventually it became a term that, it referred mostly to Afrikaans descendants, or to Dutch descendants who then, ended up speaking Afrikaans and living also in the Cape Colony and Natal, but they made up the majority of the Free State and the Transvaal.
Okay, so you mentioned, I think, 3 states there, and how many?
And then just to the north of those 2 Boer republics was another British colony of Natal. So those 4 colonies were independent of one another until after the South African War of 1899 to 1902 broke out.
Hey everyone, Scott here. We're going to take a very short break,